Kash Patel leaned into the microphone, his voice sharp, his smirk deliberate. With a dismissive wave of his hand, he cut through the noise of the studio. "Congresswoman Crockett," he sneered, "do you even understand what you're talking about? Or are you just here to repeat talking points?" The words hung in the air like a slap. The audience stirred, a mix of gasps and whispers rippling through the room. The anchors shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between the two figures locked in a silent standoff. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't bite back with anger, didn't mirror the sneer thrown at her. Instead, she sat perfectly. Still, her expression calm, her eyes steady. It was a face that said everything without speaking. "I've seen worse." The camera zoomed in on her. Capturing that quiet fire. A stillness that was louder than Patel's mockery. In that moment, the contrast was impossible to ignore. Patel, brash and arrogant, swinging wildly with insults. Crockett, composed and unshaken, absorbing it all like steel. The narrator's voice cut in, heavy with meaning. This wasn't just a debate. This was a test. Dignity against mockery, authenticity against arrogance, truth against noise. The silence deepened, as if the entire studio leaned forward at once. Every breath, every eye, every camera trained on Crockett, waiting for the reply that would either crumble or crown her in that moment. The anchors didn't move. The audience didn't dare whisper. Even Patel seemed to falter, the weight of that calm gaze throwing off his rhythm. And then Crockett shifted forward ever so slightly, the faintest spark crossing her eyes. You could feel the tension breaking like the air before a storm. The narrator's voice returned, drawing the audience closer, line by line. Because this wasn't just politics. This was about respect, about who gets to speak with authority in America. And Patel had no idea. The words trailed off, cutting into a silence so deep it echoed through the studio that what came next would leave him speechless and America stunned. Kash Patel had built a reputation, and not a quiet one. To his followers, he was the ultimate Trump loyalist, brash, combative, and always ready to throw a punch with words. He thrived on chaos, speaking louder than his critics, spinning conspiracies. With a grin and weaponizing ridicule like it was second nature, to some that made him fearless. To others, it made him reckless. But one thing was certain. Patel was used to getting the last word. That's why his jab at Jasmine Crockett carried more than a simple insult. It wasn't just him questioning her intelligence. It was him trying to strip away her credibility. In front of the country, he wasn't just challenging her policy stance. He was taking aim at her very identity. Who gets to be seen as smart? Who gets to be taken seriously in American politics? Patel's sneer said. Not her, but Jasmine Crockett was no ordinary target. She wasn't a creature of Washington's backrooms or cable TV studios. She wasn't polished in the way the establishment expected, but that was her strength. Crockett represented something Patel couldn't fake, lived authenticity. She had walked into courtrooms, stood with communities, and carried the weight of stories too real to be spun away. She didn't need to yell. Her power was different, deeper, rooted in something Patel couldn't touch, truth. As Patel pressed, piling on with his mocking tone, the cameras began to capture something else. Happening outside the studio, social media lit up. Within minutes, hashtag sparked, hashtag Crockett.com, highlighting her composure. Hashtag Patel exposed, skewering his arrogance. Short clips of Patel's sneer contrasted with Crockett's steady silence were already bouncing across timelines captioned, with words like "This is what grace under fire looks like," and "the calm before the storm." The chatter built into a digital chorus. Viewers weren't just watching a debate, they were choosing sides in real time. Too many Patel symbolized everything wrong with politics: bluster, entitlement, noise. Crockett was becoming the antidote. Sharp, grounded, unbothered. The narrator's voice cut in again, stitching together the meaning behind the moment. What Patel didn't understand was that this wasn't just about a question. This was about a fight over whose story gets to define America's future. The arrogance of loyalty to power, or the authenticity of loyalty to people. The energy shifted. The crowd could feel it. even before Crockett opened her mouth. The anchors, once tight-lipped, leaned in. Something was turning, because Patel had played his hand the same way he always did, with swagger, with mockery, with the volume turned up. But across from him sat someone who didn't play by his rules, someone younger, sharper, and unwilling to bow to the spectacle. The narrator's tone sharpened. Carrying the tension to its peak, Patel thought he was winning with noise. But what he didn't realize was that Crockett's silence was already louder than anything he could say. And as the hashtags climbed, as the audience leaned further into their seats, as Patel continued to mistake calm for weakness, the trap was already set. The line dropped like a drumbeat, and Patel had no clue the tables were about to turn. Kash Patel didn't stumble onto the national stage by accident. His rise was deliberate, crafted in the shadows of the Trump White House, where loyalty mattered more than integrity, and volume carried more weight than vision. He started as a mid-level aide, an insider whose sharp elbows and willingness to bend the truth made him indispensable to the power structures he served. While others hesitated, Patel charged forward, spinning narratives, crafting defenses, and throwing himself into controversies with a zeal that blurred the line between advocacy and propaganda. In that environment, Patel thrived. To Trump and his circle, his brashness was a feature, not a bug. He became the fighter they wanted on air, someone who would take on journalists, mock opponents, and deflect with a grin when the facts didn't line up. What he lacked in substance, he replaced with swagger. What he lacked in truth, he buried under repetition. And soon enough, he had built a reputation. The ever-combative Trump loyalist, always ready with a counterpunch, no matter how flimsy the ground he stood on. But for all the noise, cracks began to show. Patel's sound bites replayed over the years painted a picture not of a fearless truth-teller, but of a man addicted to performance. On one clip, he proclaimed himself a defender of real facts, only to be corrected mid-interview by a reporter armed with documents. Another time, pressed on the specifics of a claim, Patel resorted to what became his trademark, deflection by volume. He laughed louder, interrupted more, and smirked through the correction as if arrogance could shield him from accountability. And yet, to a certain audience, it worked. Patel cultivated an image, the fighter who said it like it is, even when what he said was riddled with distortions. He leaned into conspiracies that fueled outrage, capitalized on division, and painted himself as the anti-elite warrior. But in reality, he had become what he claimed to despise, a media figure clinging to relevance through noise, not substance. The hypocrisy ran deep. He claimed to champion transparency, yet dodged accountability when asked about his own record. He called himself a truth-teller. Yet his career was littered with disinformation campaigns and half-baked talking points designed to inflame, not inform. Time and again, Patel's arrogance kept him afloat, but only just. Each misstep, each hollow defense, was another crack in the armor he pretended was impenetrable. And then there was the arrogance, the disdain he carried into every interaction. He wasn't debating to understand or even to win an argument. He was performing, playing to an audience that rewarded mockery over substance. He smirked when others spoke, rolled his eyes at facts, and wielded his voice like a blunt weapon, drowning out dissent rather than addressing it. His pattern was clear: attack, deflect, escalate. Always louder, always meaner. The narrator's voice cut through, pulling the threads together. Kash Patel built his career on volume, not vision. His rise was never about building, but about breaking. Not about truth, but about spectacle. For years, he convinced people that arrogance was strength, that mockery was wit, that noise was substance. But what happens when the noise collides? With someone who cannot be shaken? That was the danger Patel never recognized. His tactics worked on journalists, on panels, on rivals, unprepared for his relentless interruptions. But against someone like Jasmine Crockett, grounded, calm, and unwilling to bow, the performance began to look like what it always was: hollow. Patel's past played like a reel in the minds of those who watched. He remembered the time he brushed off a question about ethics with a chuckle, the time he doubled down on a claim already proven false, The way he sneered at opponents, reducing real struggles to punchlines. And in that debate room, with Crockett sitting across from him, those cracks were no longer invisible. They were widening. For decades, Patel's strategy had been simple. Dominate the conversation. Dominance, it turned out, wasn't the same. As leadership, arrogance, no matter how polished, was still fragile when faced with authenticity. The narrator's final line lingered. Heavy with foreshadowing, Patel built his career on volume, not vision. But volume can't drown out truth, and Jasmine Crockett wasn't built to bow. Jasmine Crockett's story doesn't begin under the bright lights of Washington or in the glare of television cameras. It begins in the heart of Texas, in a working-class household where resilience was a daily lesson and dignity was earned, not handed down. She grew up watching her family work long hours, stretching every dollar, teaching her that strength wasn't about titles or privilege, it was about survival, about standing tall even when the world tried to bend you. Those roots shaped her. They taught her that education wasn't simply about grades or prestige, but about creating a pathway, not just for herself but for her community. She worked her way through school, defying expectations, carrying the weight of not just her own ambition, but the hopes of those who looked at her and thought, if she can, maybe I can too. When she finally walked across that stage to receive her law degree, it wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a collective victory. Every sacrifice, every late-night study session, every doubt she had crushed became a testament to what grit could accomplish. But Jasmine didn't stop there. She didn't take her degree and vanish into a corporate office for comfort and profit. She went where the fight was, into courtrooms where the powerless faced systems stacked against them, into communities where voices had long been ignored. She fought for tenants threatened with eviction, for workers cheated of their pay, for families facing deportation. Case by case, client by client, she carved out a reputation not just as an attorney, but as an advocate. Someone who stood at the barricades when others turned away. That is where her credibility was forged, not in echo chambers or on cable news segments, but in the trenches of real struggle. Every victory mattered, not because it added a line to her resume, but because it changed a life, protected a home, preserved a family. Her education wasn't abstract. It was alive, breathing in the people she defended. Contrast that with Patel. He stood on platforms built by privilege, wielding access to power he had never had to fight for. He learned to raise his voice, to spin his stories, to cultivate arrogance, like a brand. Crockett, by contrast, learned humility and fire from lived experience. Where Patel performed for cameras, Crockett carried scars from the courtroom battles that rarely made headlines, but transformed the communities that knew her name, and those communities mattered. Immigrant families who saw in her a champion who understood their fear and their hope. Working-class parents who recognized in her the struggle to give children a better chance. Young people of color who, looking at her, saw not just representation, but proof that they too could walk into the halls of power without apology. Her very presence became political, statement in itself that authenticity would not be silenced, that dignity would not be mocked into submission. For those who had long been told they didn't belong, Crockett's rise was validation. She wasn't just a congresswoman, she was the embodiment of resilience, of families who sacrificed, of communities that endured, of voices that had long been ignored. And through it all, she never forgot where she came from. She carried Texas grit into every debate, every policy fight, every press conference. Her cadence, her conviction, her refusal to bow, they were all rooted in the working-class soil that raised her. She knew what it was like to walk into a room where people doubted you. She knew what it was like to be underestimated. And she had long ago decided she would turn that doubt into her greatest weapon. The narrator's voice cut in, framing the story with gravity. This wasn't just another politician. This was a daughter of grit, carrying her community on her shoulders. Every courtroom victory, every fight for justice, every step forward was not for her alone. It was for all those who came before and all those who would follow. Patel sneered, dismissing her education. His arrogance wasn't just directed at Crockett. It was aimed at every working-class kid who ever scraped their way through school. Every immigrant family who dreamed of a better life. Every voice that had been silenced by the establishment. But Crockett was not built to bow. She was built to rise. And as Patel leaned on mockery, Jasmine leaned on truth. She had weathered storms bigger than his arrogance, faced struggles deeper than his dismissals. That night on stage, her calm wasn't a weakness. It was the steel of someone who had been forged in fire. The narrator's final words of the section landed like a drumbeat, and when Patel tried to diminish her, Crockett didn't flinch. She fired back. The studio lights burned brighter, as if they too were leaning in, waiting for what came next. Kash Patel smirked, the kind of smirk honed from years of living in spin rooms, thriving off confrontation. His voice rose above the air-conditioned silence, laced with mockery. "Tell us, Congresswoman, what makes you think you even understand the law better than people who've actually shaped this country?" He dragged the word "actually," savoring its sting, his tone dripping with arrogance. It wasn't just a question. It was a dismissal, a challenge meant to belittle. To remind the room of hierarchy, his loud and privileged, hers, young and insurgent. Patel leaned back in his chair as though satisfied he had delivered the final blow. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She leaned slightly forward, her eyes locked on him with the precision of a lawyer cross-examining a hostile witness. Her voice, calm yet razor-sharp, sliced through the tension. "Do you want me to list every courtroom where I fought for justice?" The words landed like a gavel striking wood. Gasps rippled through the audience. The anchors at the desk froze, glancing nervously between each other, as though unsure if they should intervene or let the silence hang. In that silence, the balance of the room began to shift. Patel blinked. His smirk faltered for just a moment, as if the weight of her response pierced through the armor of rehearsed bravado. He tried to recover quickly, raising his voice louder. Faster. "Oh, please don't act like your resume means you know what's best for America. This country doesn't need activists pretending to be leaders." But the desperation was audible now. His tone no longer carried command. It carried defense. Crockett didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She let Patel's words hang, then cut them down with deliberate precision. "Leadership isn't about volume, Mr. Patel. It's about vision. And vision comes from seeing people where they are, not mocking them for who they are." The audience murmured louder now, some nodding, others whispering, while Patel's posture shifted from smug to unsettled. His hands twitched against the desk, his voice straining as he attempted another jab. "Oh, that's rich. You think listing a few? Cases makes you," but Crockett interrupted, not by shouting him down, but with timing so sharp it made his words collapse mid-sentence. "Not a few cases, families, workers, immigrants, people who needed someone to stand when they had no one else. That's what I did. That's what I do. And that's what makes the difference." This time, the murmurs turned into a wave of reaction. A mixture of gasps and faint applause the moderators couldn't contain. The anchors exchanged wide-eyed glances, Patel's in their seats. Patel's voice cracked slightly as he scrambled for footing. "So what? You're saying you're better then? And again?" Crockett seized the moment with unnerving calm. "I'm saying service is better than spectacle. And America is smart enough to know the difference." That line landed like thunder. The entire studio seemed to hold its breath. Patel opened his mouth, but no words came. His shoulders stiffened, his lips tightened. But his comeback evaporated in the silence Crockett commanded. The narrator's voice broke in, low and charged. With suspense, everyone watching could feel the balance shifting. The arrogance that once filled the air was being replaced by something heavier: truth. On social media, hashtags lit up in real time. Hashtag Crockett.com, hashtag Patel exposed. Clips of the exchange were already being clipped, looped, shared. But inside the studio, all eyes stayed fixed on the stage, where a shift more profound than trending tags was unfolding. Because in that silence, in that piercing calm, it became clear. Patel wasn't leading the debate anymore. He was surviving it, and the narrator delivered the cliffhanger with a hush that felt like a drumbeat. And then came the line that cracked the room wide open. The tension in the studio was thick enough to taste. Kash Patel, still fumbling for words, tried to laugh it off, his chuckle brittle, hollow. But Jasmine Crockett didn't give him the oxygen of time. She leaned in just slightly, her voice calm yet commanding, cutting through the haze with surgical clarity. "You asked about my education, Mr. Patel? Let me enlighten you." The audience shifted in their seats. The anchor sat forward as though leaning closer to a story that was no longer a debate but a reckoning. "I studied law at the Thurgood Marshall School of Law," Crockett said, her voice firm, unwavering. "Named for the man who dismantled segregation in our courts. I didn't just memorize case law. I carried it into courtrooms where people's livelihoods, their families, their futures were on the line." Patel's smirk twitched, collapsing into a stiff jaw as Crockett pressed on. "I have stood in front of judges and juries defending those who had no one else to defend them. I've fought for workers cheated out of wages, for families terrorized by eviction notices, for communities told they were too small, too poor, too powerless to matter." Her words hit like a drumbeat, each example louder than the one before. "I didn't inherit privilege. I earned every credential by standing shoulder to shoulder with the people you so easily dismiss. I've seen the face of injustice. I've held the hands of clients who didn't know if they'd make it through. The weak, and I brought the law into those rooms, not as a weapon for the powerful, but as a shield for the powerless." The murmurs in the crowd rose into audible gasps. Patel shifted again, visibly rattled, his hand tightening on the desk. But Crockett wasn't finished. "You see, education isn't about where you sit." She paused, letting the silence stretch, the weight of her words hanging in the air. "It's about who you serve." That line didn't just land, it detonated. The studio fell into a silence so sharp it rang louder than applause. The anchors froze, lips parted but speechless. Patel blinked rapidly, his mouth open but empty of words. For the first time in his career of spin, there was nothing to spin. The cameras caught it all. Patel's stunned face, the wide-eyed expressions in the crowd, the anchors gripping their notes like lifelines. And then, as if on cue, the silence cracked with the audience breaking into a wave of applause. Some clapped cautiously, others stood up, their cheers carrying the moment beyond the studio walls. On social media, the reaction was instantaneous. Hashtags exploded. Hashtag legendary response. Hashtag Crockett schools Patel. Hashtag mic drop moment. Clips of Crockett's words, especially the line "education isn't about where you sit, it's about who you serve," spread like wildfire. Within minutes, the phrase was trending across Twitter, Instagram Reels, TikTok stitches. Users overlaid it on graphics of Thurgood Marshall, side by side with Crockett's.com face and Patel's stunned silence. The narrator's voice cut through the roar. Heavy with drama, this wasn't just a rebuttal. It was the collapse of a myth, the myth that loudness is strength, that privilege equals wisdom, that arrogance can pass as truth. Patel tried to recover, but his body language betrayed him. His shoulders slumped slightly, his hands fidgeted. His voice strained with a false confidence that no one was buying anymore.
Oh.
"That's all nice for your little activist resume," but the words tripped over themselves, dissolving in the face of Crockett's calm fire. She didn't even need to interrupt him. His voice grew smaller with every syllable. The camera zoomed in, capturing every flicker of Patel's discomfort. A split-screen feed circulated instantly online. On one side, Patel struggling to regain ground, on the other, Crockett sitting poised, composed untouchable. The narrator's tone rose, urgent and cinematic. In that moment, the power dynamic flipped. Patel, who built his persona on swagger and noise, was unraveling. Crockett, armed with dignity and truth, was rewriting the script of what leadership looks like. Audience reaction shots told the story better than words. One woman in the front row had her hands clasped over her mouth, eyes wide in disbelief. A young man pumped his fist quietly, mouthing the words, "That's it." Even the anchors, struggling to remain neutral, looked shaken, their silence speaking louder than any commentary they could have given. The online buzz mirrored the studio shock. "She just destroyed him with facts," one post read, already racking up thousands of likes. Another viral clip highlighted Patel's expression captioned, "When you realize you picked the wrong person to mess with." Late-night commentators began weighing in even before the broadcast ended. One comedian tweeted, "Crockett just sent Patel back to the minors." That was brutal. Celebrities, activists, and everyday viewers piled on, amplifying the clip with hashtags and reaction videos. But back in the studio, Jasmine Crockett wasn't basking in applause. She sat still, her hands folded, her gaze steady. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't resorted to spectacle. She had done something far more powerful. She had turned Patel's insult into an indictment of his entire approach. The narrator's voice swelled with a sense of history. It wasn't just Patel who was stunned. It was an entire audience, an entire country watching live who realized something deeper, that truth, spoken with conviction, doesn't need theatrics. It simply is. Patel opened his mouth one more time, but his words tangled. The contrast was glaring. Crockett, serene and composed, versus Patel, loud but empty. And as the segment drew to a close, the energy in the room was undeniable. The myth of Patel's invincibility had cracked wide open. The narrator leaned in with the cliffhanger, but outside the studio, the shockwaves would only grow louder. The broadcast wasn't even over before the internet caught fire. On Twitter now, the hashtags blazed into trending territory within minutes. Hashtag Crockett schools Patel. Hashtag legendary response. Hashtag mic drop moment. Notifications stacked faster than the servers could handle.
Ow.
Each clip of Crockett's calm dismantling of Patel shared, stitched, craze. Stunned face became instant meme currency. Side-by-side edits spread like wildfire. Patel blinking in disbelief on the left, Crockett poised and unshaken on the right. Some captions read, "Volume down. Truth up." Others mocked Patel's collapse. When you realize the courtroom is louder than your Twitter feed. On TikTok, reaction videos multiplied. Young viewers mouthed along to Crockett's line. Education isn't about where you sit, it's about who you serve. Each lip sync amplified her words, bedding them into the cultural bloodstream. The narrator's voice rose with cinematic weight. This wasn't just a moment on live television. It was the kind of cultural flashpoint that ripples far beyond. The screen, late-night comedians wasted no time. One cracked. Patel thought he was debating a rookie. Another quipped, "You could hear the silence in that studio, louder than Patel's entire career." The audiences roared, not just at Patel's humiliation, but at Crockett's composure, the rare mix of dignity and fire that made people sit up straighter. Political pundits joined the chorus. Commentators on cable and podcasts marveled at the reversal. A Trump world warrior, usually so adept at hijacking conversations, left exposed by a first-term congresswoman who refused to play his game. Progressive voices highlighted the symbolism. A woman of color, grounded in lived struggle, dismantling the swagger of privilege in real time. But it wasn't only media figures weighing in. Grassroots activists, local organizers, and community leaders flooded platforms with praise. One union leader wrote, "That's what representation looks like. Calm, sharp, unflinching." An immigrant rights activist tweeted, "Crockett didn't just answer Patel. She answered for every one of us who's ever had our intelligence questioned." Celebrities added fuel. A-list actors reposted the clip. Musicians quoted her line. In solidarity, influencers told millions of followers that this was the moment politics felt human again. The amplification turned Crockett from congresswoman to cultural icon overnight. And for young viewers, students, Americans, activists in training, her performance became something bigger than politics. It became a source of pride. Comments on YouTube and Instagram were filled with words like "finally," "needed this," and "representation matters." The narrator's voice sharpened. This wasn't just a debate. It became a cultural earthquake. A fault line cracked. Wide open between the politics of noise and the politics of truth, even Patel's supporters couldn't avoid the tidal wave. Attempts to spin the clash rang hollow. Clips labeled out of context were drowned out by the raw footage looping endlessly online. Each denial only made the moment spread further. Behind the laughter and the memes, though, something deeper stirred. People weren't just entertained, they were inspired. Comment threads filled with personal stories. First-generation lawyers, working-class kids, immigrant families who had been told they didn't belong. Crockett's line about service struck them like lightning. A young viewer wrote, "As someone who just got told I'd never make it to law school, hearing her say this gave me chills. I needed that." She spoke for us. For every person who had to fight twice as hard to prove they belong, the narrator leaned in, voice heavy with meaning. Because beneath the laughter, beneath the roasts and hashtags, something far more powerful was crystallizing, the lesson that dignity outlasts arrogance, and truth endures long after mockery fades. The memes kept coming. The hashtags kept trending. The applause echoed beyond the studio. But the story wasn't finished. The narrator's tone sharpened to a cliffhanger, and behind the laughter, deeper truth was about to surface. As the storm of memes and commentary swirled, Jasmine Crockett herself shifted the conversation. She didn't bask in the spotlight or trade insults back at Patel. Instead, she reframed the entire clash, turning what could have been remembered as a sparring match into something greater. A lesson. Crockett reminded audiences why she entered public service in the first place. Her words carried the weight of lived struggle and the clarity of purpose. Leadership isn't about ego. It's about service. It's about showing up for the people who rarely get heard. Not for the cameras, not for yourself. The narrator's voice threaded the moment with gravitas. In a political culture obsessed with sound bites and theater, Crockett chose substance. She chose dignity. And in doing so, she flipped the definition of power itself. Her message cut deeper than Patel's sneers ever could, because Patel represented a familiar archetype, the loud voice, the boastful presence, the arrogance mistaken for authority. Crockett countered with authenticity, lived credibility, the moral conviction that service, not status, defines real leadership. She drew the contrast cleanly: arrogance versus humility, bluster versus truth, celebrity versus community. Where Patel leaned on noise, she leaned on results. Where he inflated his presence, she rooted hers in reality. The audience could feel the shift, not just in the studio, but across living rooms, classrooms, phone screens nationwide. Her emotional crescendo landed with words destined to echo. The real measure of strength is not who shouts the loudest, but who stands tallest in truth. For those watching, the impact was unmistakable. Parents told their kids to listen. Teachers replayed the line in classrooms. Community leaders quoted it at rallies. It wasn't just a soundbite. It was a creed, something larger than the moment that birthed it. The narrator underscored the transformation. Experience without empathy is empty. But truth, with conviction, reshapes history. This, then, was the lesson left behind. Crockett reminded the country that education isn't just about pedigree, that leadership isn't just about tenure, that authority isn't earned by volume. Instead, it's about dignity, about authenticity, about standing rooted in the struggles of real people and daring to serve them with honesty. In an era when arrogance often masquerades as strength, Crockett revealed a deeper truth: that authenticity outlasts theatrics and humility outshines hubris. And in that reframing, she left Patel diminished. Not because she embarrassed him, but because she exposed the emptiness of his posture. The moment lived far beyond the debate itself. For the communities who had long been told they weren't enough, Crockett became a mirror of possibility. For the establishment that relied on condescension to hold power, she became a warning. The narrator's voice swelled like the closing notes of an anthem. And this clash was only one chapter in the fight for America's soul. In the end, what began as a sneer, a mocking attempt to belittle Jasmine Crockett, transformed into something unforgettable. Patel tried to reduce her to a punchline, but Crockett turned that insult into inspiration. Where arrogance swung, authenticity stood firm. Where noise tried to dominate, a truth held the ground. The narrator's voice drew the threads together. This wasn't just a debate stage, it was a reminder. A reminder that dignity outlasts mockery, that authenticity beats spin, and that real Leadership is measured not by who can shout the loudest, but by who can stand tallest in truth. The story didn't end with Patel's silence. It carried forward in the voices of millions who saw themselves in Crockett's poise, who found validation in her words, and who felt a spark of hope in her calm defiance. And that's where you come in. Because this fight, the fight for truth, dignity, and justice, isn't confined to a single debate. It's happening every day, in every community, in every corner of America. So if you believe in amplifying voices like Crockett's, if you believe arrogance must never go unchallenged, if you believe authenticity and service should guide this nation's future, then subscribe to this channel, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and be part of a movement that refuses to bow to noise. Together, we will not only remember this moment, we will build on it. We will carry forward the lesson that truth lived and spoken has the power to shake foundations. Final words ring like a promise. Together, we will write the next chapter of America's promise.